The summer of 1914 began like any other across Europe. Families gathered in sunlit gardens, children played in cobblestone streets, and young men dreamed of futures filled with possibility. Within weeks, those same young men would be standing in muddy trenches, holding rifles they barely knew how to fire, waiting for orders that would likely end their lives. The Great War, as it would come to be known, promised glory and adventure. What it delivered was something far darker, far more brutal, and far more carefully hidden from the public eye than most history books dare to reveal. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, few could have predicted that this single event would trigger a cascade of alliances and declarations that would plunge the world into the deadliest conflict humanity had yet witnessed. But what makes this war particularly haunting is not just the scale of death, but the deliberate efforts by governments and military commanders to conceal the true nature of the horror from their own citizens. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas stretched into 4 years of systematic slaughter, and the men who survived often wished they hadn't. The Western Front became a graveyard that stretched for 440 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Along this scar across Europe, millions of men lived and died in conditions that defy comfortable description. The trenches were not merely uncomfortable military positions. They were open graves, where men stood in water mixed with their own waste, watching rats feed on the corpses of their comrades. The official photographs sent home to families showed soldiers smiling, clean-faced, ready for battle. What the cameras never captured were the bodies swollen beyond recognition, the men screaming through gas-damaged lungs, the suicides that happened almost daily when soldiers could no longer bear another morning of waiting to die. Trench foot claimed thousands of soldiers, a condition where feet would literally rot away inside waterlogged boots. Men would lose toes, then feet, then legs, not from enemy bullets, but from standing in cold, contaminated water for weeks at a time. Medical officers knew about the condition early in the war, yet proper drainage systems and rotation schedules that could have prevented much of the suffering were considered too costly in terms of tactical positioning. Commanders made calculated decisions that preserving territorial lines was worth more than preserving the feet of enlisted men. These were not accidents of war. These were choices made by men who slept in dry beds far behind the lines. The psychological cost of trench warfare revealed something that military establishments were completely unprepared to acknowledge. The human mind was not designed to withstand industrialized killing. Soldiers began exhibiting symptoms that physicians had never encountered on such a massive scale. Men would shake uncontrollably, unable to speak, unable to sleep, unable to function. They called it shell shock at first, a term that suggested a temporary condition caused by the concussive force of artillery. But this was a convenient misunderstanding. What these men were experiencing was the complete psychological breakdown that occurs when a human being is forced to live for months in constant proximity to death, watching friends torn apart, knowing that any moment might be their last, and having no escape, no hope of it ending. The military response to shell shock was not compassion, but suspicion. Thousands of soldiers suffering from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder were court-martialed for cowardice. They were shot by firing squads made up of their own countrymen, killed not by the enemy but by their own armies for the crime of being psychologically destroyed by the war. The British Army alone executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war, many of them teenage boys who had lied about their age to enlist. France executed at least 600. These executions were kept quiet, mentioned in dispatches as deaths in action or accidents. Families mourned their sons, never knowing that they had been shot at dawn while trembling and crying, unable to control their own bodies. One physician who treated shell shock victims wrote in his private journal that he was witnessing the creation of a new kind of human being, one who had seen things that fundamentally altered their relationship with reality. These men returned home, unable to explain what they had experienced, because the language did not exist to describe it, and society did not want to hear it anyway. Victory parades celebrated the heroes. The broken men were hidden away in institutions, their families told to be grateful they came home at all. The true casualty numbers of the war should not only count the dead, but the living who were never whole again. Then came the gas. On April 22, 1915, near Ypres in Belgium, German forces released 160 tons of chlorine gas across a 4-mile front. Allied soldiers watched a strange yellow-green cloud drift toward them with the wind. Some thought it was a smoke screen. Within minutes, men were choking, their lungs filling with fluid, drowning in the open air. 5,000 men died in the first attack. The survivors described watching their comrades turn blue, coughing up blood and pieces of their own lungs, clawing at their throats as they suffocated. The gas attack violated every existing convention of warfare, but it was effective, and that was what mattered. Within months, all sides were using chemical weapons. Phosgene, chlorine, and eventually mustard gas became standard artillery loads. Mustard gas was particularly insidious. It didn't kill immediately. It burned through uniforms, blistered skin, blinded eyes, and scarred lungs. Men would seem fine for hours after exposure, then slowly deteriorate over days, dying in hospital beds in agony that morphine could barely touch. By the war's end, over 1 million casualties were attributed to chemical weapons. But this number only counts those who died or were hospitalized. Tens of thousands more suffered chronic health effects that were never officially connected to gas exposure. Governments on all sides knew exactly what these weapons did to the human body, yet they continued to develop more effective variants, more efficient methods of delivery, more painful ways to kill enemy soldiers. The public back home was told that gas attacks were a German innovation, a sign of their barbarism and disregard for civilized warfare. What citizens were not told was that their own governments were producing and deploying chemical weapons on an industrial scale. Factories in Britain, France, and the United States manufactured thousands of tons of poisonous chemicals. Workers in these facilities often had no idea what they were producing, and when accidents occurred, as they frequently did, the incidents were classified as industrial mishaps unrelated to the war effort. The truth about chemical warfare was too ugly to admit, especially when governments needed their citizens to keep supporting the war with taxes, bonds, and their sons. Perhaps the most carefully guarded secret of the Great War was the true scale of death. Official casualty figures were manipulated, delayed, and deliberately understated throughout the conflict. When the Battle of the Somme began on July 1, 1916, British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, with almost 20,000 dead. This remains the single bloodiest day in British military history. Yet newspapers back in London reported a successful advance with acceptable losses. The word acceptable was doing tremendous work in that sentence. The lists of dead and wounded were published gradually, spread over weeks and months so that the full horror of what had happened would never hit the public consciousness all at once. Soldiers at the front knew they were participating in something monstrous. Letters home were heavily censored, with military officials reading every word before mail was sent. Men developed coded language to communicate the reality of conditions to their families. They would write about weather being particularly difficult, or supplies being short, or morale being tested. Families learned to read between the lines, but they never learned the full truth. Soldiers who managed to return home on leave were often unable to speak about what they had witnessed. The contrast between the mud and blood of the trenches and the peaceful ignorance of civilian life created a chasm that could not be bridged with words. The strategic thinking behind many battles revealed a callousness that would shock modern observers. Commanders would order waves of men to charge across open ground toward machine gun positions, knowing that the first waves would be slaughtered, but calculating that eventually the machine guns would run out of ammunition or their barrels would overeat. Soldiers were literally used as expendable resources to deplete enemy supplies. After one such assault, a British officer recorded in his diary that the operation had been successful because enemy machine guns had been forced to stop firing after killing so many of his men. Success was measured not in ground gained or tactical advantage secured, but in whether the enemy had been forced to expend bullets. The Christmas truce of 1914 revealed something that military authorities found deeply threatening. Along various sections of the Western Front, British and German soldiers spontaneously stopped fighting, climbed out of their trenches, and met in no man's land. They exchanged gifts, played football, sang carols, and buried their dead together. For a brief moment, these men recognized each other as human beings trapped in the same nightmare. When news of this reached high command, orders were immediately issued that such fraternization was to be considered treasonous. Officers were instructed to ensure that no similar truce would occur in subsequent years. The war machine could not function if soldiers remembered that the men they were trying to kill were not monsters, but ordinary people who wanted to go home just as badly as they did. As the war dragged into its third and fourth years, desperation led to innovation in the methods of killing. Flamethrowers, first deployed by German forces in 1915, created casualties that were beyond grotesque. Men burned alive, screamed in ways that other soldiers never forgot. Tank warfare began as a British experiment to break the stalemate of trench warfare. These mechanical monsters could cross trenches and crush barbed wire, but they were also death traps for their crews. The interior temperature of early tanks could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews breathed fumes from the engine and their own weapons. When a tank was hit by artillery, the crew was either incinerated or drowned in burning oil. Yet the propaganda films showed tanks as invincible war machines, symbols of industrial superiority and certain victory. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed more people globally than the entire war, but its connection to the conflict is rarely emphasized. The movement of millions of soldiers around the world, living in close quarters with poor sanitation, created perfect conditions for the virus to spread and mutate. Military authorities suppressed news of the outbreak to maintain morale. Spain, being neutral in the war, had no wartime censorship and reported on the epidemic freely, which is why it became known as the Spanish flu. Despite not originating there, soldiers were dying of disease in numbers that sometimes exceeded combat casualties, but this information was classified. The public was told that their boys were dying heroically in battle, not coughing up blood in overcrowded hospital tents, killed by a virus their own governments helped spread through gross negligence of basic health measures. When the armistice finally came on November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, soldiers in the trenches reacted with more exhaustion than celebration. They had survived, but they had lost something essential in the process. The official death toll was calculated at approximately 17 million people, with another 20 million wounded. But these numbers cannot capture the amputees who spent the rest of their lives begging on street corners, the blind men who would never see their children grow up, the men who died by suicide years later because they could never escape the trenches in their minds. The true cost of the Great War cannot be measured in statistics alone. The governments and military establishments of the Allied and Central Powers spent the decades following the war constructing narratives of heroism, sacrifice, and necessary conflict. Memorials were built, and names were carved in stone. The suffering was repackaged as glory. The waste was reframed as inevitability. And slowly, carefully, the true nature of what had been done to an entire generation of young men was buried under ceremony and sentiment. The history books focused on strategies and battles, on dates and generals, on politics and treaties. What they left out were the bodies rotting in the mud, the men shot by their own side for being too broken to fight, the chemical weapons that scarred lungs and blinded eyes, and the deliberate lies told to families who would never know how their sons really died. But the Great War was only the beginning. The lessons learned about propaganda, about chemical weapons, about the industrial capacity for slaughter, about how to control information and hide uncomfortable truths from the public, all of these lessons would be applied with even greater efficiency and devastating effect in the decades to come. If the First World War revealed the dark potential of modern industrial conflict, the Second World War would exceed every horror that came before it in ways that would make the trenches of the Somme seem almost quaint by comparison. And the secrets kept during that next conflict would make the cover-ups of the Great War look like amateur efforts. The darkness was only just beginning to spread.